Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The wind came in from the north before dawn, a low roar that built steadily as Trooper Shell Udegaard checked his fuel gauge and pulled out of the Coldfoot station lot. The thermometer on the dash read -38, and the sky had that bruised look that promised snow within the hour. He'd been awake since 3, listening to the dispatcher's voice crackle through updates about a southbound semi that had failed to check in at the last waypoint. The Dalton Highway stretched ahead, a ribbon of packed snow and ice, threading through country that swallowed men whole if they made even one mistake. Udegaard had patrolled this road for 6 years, long enough to know that the margin for error shrank with every degree the temperature dropped. The radio hissed, then cleared. Sila Aputi's voice came through, calm and measured as always. Unit 7, be advised weather service just upgraded to blizzard warning. Effective 0600. Visibility dropping fast north of Finger Mountain. Udegaard thumbed the mic. Copy that. Any word from the missing truck? A pause, then negative. Last known was mile marker 216. That was 0340. Should have hit Yukon River crossing by 05 at the latest. He did the math in his head. The driver was either broken down, stuck, or deliberately off the grid. None of those options were good. The highway had become a magnet for smugglers in recent months, freight haulers running modified cargo that never appeared on manifests. Enforcement was thin up here, and everyone knew it. The first flakes hit the windshield as he passed mile 200, fat and slow at first, then smaller and faster, driving almost horizontal in the wind. Within 10 minutes, the world narrowed to a tunnel of white. His headlights carved a feeble cone through the storm, barely reaching the edge of the roadbed. He slowed to 30, then 25, trusting the feel of the pavement more than his eyes. The heater roared, but cold seeped in through every gap in the door seals, through the firewall, through the floorboards. His breath fogged the windshield faster than the defroster could clear it, forcing him to wipe the glass with his glove every few minutes. The storm wasn't just weather anymore. It was a physical presence, pushing against the vehicle with enough force that he had to correct constantly to stay centered in the lane. At mile 220, he spotted something through the whiteout, a dark shape that resolved into the missing semi as he approached. The truck sat at an angle across both lanes, blocking the road completely, its running lights still on but the cab dark. Udegaard pulled up 30 yards back and keyed his radio. Dispatch, Unit 7. Located the missing commercial vehicle, mile marker 220. Appears abandoned, no visible occupant. Requesting you contact Halver Bixby for recovery when conditions permit. Sila Aputi acknowledged, her voice crackling with static that suggested the storm was degrading radio signals. Copy, Unit 7. Be advised all recovery operations are suspended until weather clears. Current forecast shows blizzard conditions for the next 8 to 12 hours. Udegaard sat in the warmth of his vehicle for a moment, studying the semi through the storm. Something about the scene felt wrong in ways he couldn't immediately articulate. The truck's position wasn't consistent with a skid or mechanical failure. It had been parked deliberately to block the road, angled just enough that no vehicle could squeeze past on either shoulder. The running lights suggested the battery was still good, which meant the abandonment was recent. And there were no footprints visible in the snow accumulating around the cab, though that could simply mean the storm had already buried them. He pulled his parka hood tight, checked that his sidearm was accessible despite the layers of clothing, and stepped out into the wind. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his eyes water instantly. Ice crystals drove into any exposed skin with enough force to sting, and the wind was so loud he couldn't hear anything else, not the idling engine of his vehicle, not the creak of the semi's trailer settling on its suspension. He moved forward with his head down, one hand on his flashlight and the other ready to grab the door handle when he reached the cab. The snow was already knee-deep in places, drifting against the trailer's upwind side with a speed that suggested the truck would be completely buried within hours if the storm continued at this intensity. The cab door was unlocked. That detail registered immediately as wrong, because drivers on the Dalton never left their vehicles unsecured, not with the risk of equipment theft and the very real possibility that someone in distress might need to access the cab for shelter. Odegaard pulled the door open and shone his light inside. The interior was empty, the driver's seat still warm to the touch when he checked with his gloved hand. The keys were in the ignition, turned to the accessory position to keep the batteries charged but the engine off. Personal items were scattered across the passenger seat and floor. A thermos, a phone charger, a rolled-up sleeping bag, all the normal detritus of long-haul trucking. But there was no logbook, no bills of lading, no paperwork of any kind. And when Odegaard opened the glove box, it was completely empty, not even the vehicle registration that federal law required to be present. He backed out of the cab and moved to the trailer, fighting the wind with every step. The rear doors were secured with a padlock that showed fresh scratches around the keyhole, as though someone had opened it recently in poor light, or with gloved hands that made fine motor control difficult. Odegaard documented the scratches with his phone camera, knowing the images would be nearly useless in the blowing snow, but maintaining protocol anyway. He tried the lock and found it secure, then worked his way around to the trailer's side, looking for any other access points or identifying markings. The trailer was a standard dry van, white paint weathered to gray, with no company logos or DOT numbers visible. Ghost haulers sometimes ran unmarked equipment to avoid inspection, but this was brazen even by those standards. The wind shifted suddenly, and Odegaard caught a smell that made him stop. It was faint, nearly lost in the storm, but unmistakable once noticed. Diesel exhaust, but wrong somehow, mixed with something chemical and acrid that burned his nose and throat even through the cold. He followed the smell to a ventilation panel on the trailer's side, a louvered vent that was standard equipment for temperature-controlled cargo. The smell was stronger here, drifting out through gaps in the louvers. Odegaard keyed his radio, had to shout to be heard over the wind. "Dispatch, Unit 7. Need you to run a plate when you get a chance." He read off the numbers from the trailer's rear plate, squinting through the snow. Also requesting probable cause guidance for opening a commercial trailer without manifest or driver present. Sila Aputi's response was broken by static. "Unit 7, say again. You're breaking up." Odegaard repeated the request, got back only fragments. The storm was getting worse, degrading radio communications to the point where he might soon lose contact entirely. He was on his own up here, with an abandoned truck blocking the highway and a cargo that smelled wrong in ways that suggested something beyond simple smuggling. The sensible thing would be to wait in his vehicle until the storm passed and backup could reach his location. But the smell bothered him, and the complete absence of paperwork bothered him more. Drivers didn't abandon loads unless something had gone badly wrong. He returned to his vehicle and retrieved the bolt cutters from the trunk, then fought his way back to the trailer through snow that was now mid-thigh in the drifts. The lock snapped under the cutter's pressure, and Odegaard pulled the trailer doors open. The smell that rolled out was overwhelming. Chemicals and something organic that made his eyes water and his throat close. He stepped back, gagging, then forced himself to shine his light into the trailer's interior. What he saw in that first sweep of the flashlight beam would stay with him for the rest of his life. The trailer was configured as a mobile laboratory, crude but functional, with folding tables holding glassware and heating elements and plastic containers of chemicals that Odegaard recognized from narcotics training as precursors for methamphetamine production. But it was the scale that shocked him. This wasn't a small operation cooking enough product for local distribution. This was industrial, capable of producing quantities measured in kilograms per batch, with enough chemical inventory to suggest they'd been running production cycles for weeks or months. The ventilation system that had leaked the smell was a jury-rigged affair of ductwork and fans, inadequate for the volume of fumes being generated but apparently sufficient to prevent the worst accumulations of explosive vapor. Odegaard backed away from the trailer and keyed his radio again, got nothing but static. The storm had severed his communications completely. He was standing next to a rolling drug lab on an empty highway in a blizzard, with no backup and no way to call for it. The smart play was to secure the scene and wait, but something about the setup nagged at him. The lab was still warm, the heating element still plugged into a generator he could hear running somewhere in the trailer's forward section. Someone had been here recently, working, and had left in a hurry. The question was why, and whether they were planning to come back. He returned to his vehicle and repositioned it to block the road behind the semi, creating a barrier that would prevent anyone from approaching without being seen. Then he settled in to wait, engine running for heat, eyes scanning the whiteout for any movement. The visibility was down to maybe 20 feet now, the storm so intense that the semi itself was barely visible as a dark shadow in the swirling white. Time became elastic, measured only by the periodic sweep of his eyes across the mirrors and windshield, looking for shapes that didn't belong. The first indication he wasn't alone came 40 minutes later, a sound that cut through the wind's roar. An engine, high-pitched and distinctive, the whine of a snow machine being pushed hard. Odegaard killed his headlights and slumped in his seat, making himself less visible while maintaining a view of the road ahead. The sound grew louder. Then 2 headlights appeared in the whiteout, moving fast despite the conditions. The snow machine pulled up beside the semi's cab, and a figure in heavy winter gear dismounted. Odegaard couldn't make out details through the storm, but the person's movements had the purposeful quality of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and where they were going. The figure approached the trailer, stopped when they saw the broken lock, then turned in a slow circle as though searching for whoever had opened it. Odegaard felt his hand move to his sidearm, but he didn't draw. Not yet. The person moved to the snow machine and pulled something from the cargo rack, an object that resolved into a jerry can as they carried it toward the trailer. The implications hit Odegaard like a physical blow. They were going to burn it, destroy the lab and any evidence it contained, probably assuming the storm would prevent any investigation until spring thaw revealed nothing but scorched metal. He keyed his radio out of habit, got static, made his decision. He opened his door and stepped out into the storm, flashlight in one hand and his other hand visible and empty. "State Police, step away from the trailer." His voice was torn away by the wind, barely audible even to himself. The figure with the jerry can froze, then dropped the container and ran for the snow machine. Odegaard pursued, his boots slipping on ice he couldn't see under the snow, closing the distance but not fast enough. The figure reached the machine and gunned the engine, spraying snow as it accelerated into the whiteout. Odegaard stopped, breathing hard, and watched the taillight disappear into the storm. He couldn't pursue on foot, and his vehicle wasn't configured for off-road travel in these conditions. The person was gone, and with them any immediate chance of identification or arrest. He turned back to the trailer, to the jerry can lying in the snow, and felt the full weight of his situation settle over him. He had evidence of a major drug operation, but no suspect and no way to call for backup. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and he was stuck here until it passed or until someone came looking for him. He secured the trailer as best he could, using zip ties from his vehicle to bind the doors since the lock was broken. Then he photographed everything: the lab equipment, the chemical containers, the jerry can, creating a record that would survive even if the physical evidence didn't. The light was failing now, the brief Arctic day giving way to the long darkness, and the temperature was dropping into the range where exposed skin froze in seconds. Odegaard retreated to his vehicle and tried the radio again, cycling through all available frequencies. Nothing but static on every channel. The night that followed was the longest of Odegaard's career. He sat in the darkness, engine running for heat, but headlights off to preserve the battery, and watched the storm rage around him. The wind rocked the vehicle on its suspension, and snow accumulated so fast that he had to get out periodically to clear the exhaust pipe, preventing carbon monoxide from backing up into the cabin. Each time he stepped outside, the cold was a shock that reminded him how precarious his situation was. If the fuel ran out, or the engine failed, or any one of a dozen other things went wrong, he would freeze to death long before the storm passed and help could arrive. Around midnight, he saw lights again. Not the single headlight of a snow machine, but multiple lights moving in formation through the storm. Odegaard's hand went to his sidearm as he watched them approach, uncertain whether this was help or something worse. The lights resolved into a convoy, 2 heavy trucks pushing through the drifts with the kind of determination that spoke to urgency. They stopped when they reached the semi, and figures emerged, moving with military precision to surround the trailer. Odegaard stepped out of his vehicle, flashlight raised. "State Police! Identify yourselves." The figures turned toward him as one, and in the sweep of his flashlight he saw faces covered by balaclavas and winter gear that made identification impossible. Nobody spoke. They just stood there, watching him, and Odegaard felt his finger move to the trigger guard. The moment stretched, tension building until it felt like the air itself might shatter. Then one of the figures raised a hand, a gesture that could have been greeting or warning, and they all climbed back into their trucks. The convoy backed up, turned around with agonizing slowness in the narrow space between drifts, and disappeared into the storm the way it had come. Odegaard stood in the wind, shaking not entirely from the cold, and tried to process what had just happened. They'd come for the lab, seen him, and left. The calculation was clear. Whatever they stood to lose by abandoning the operation was less than the risk of engaging with law enforcement. But they'd seen his vehicle, had probably photographed it and him, and would know he was alone. The question now was whether they'd come back. He didn't sleep. He sat in the vehicle with the engine running and his sidearm on the passenger seat, watching the darkness beyond his windows, and jumping at every sound that might be something other than the storm. Dawn came slowly, the darkness giving way to gray that gradually brightened into the white hell of continued blizzard. His fuel gauge showed a quarter tank, enough for maybe 4 more hours of heat. After that, decisions would have to be made about survival versus duty. The radio crackled to life at 0700, Sila Aputi's voice cutting through the static. Unit 7, do you copy?" Odegaard grabbed the mic, his relief so intense it made his hands shake. "Dispatch, Unit 7, I copy. Still at mile 220 with the abandoned semi. Have a situation that needs immediate backup and hazmat response." He gave her a condensed version of the night's events: the lab, the attempted arson, the convoy. Her response was professional, but he could hear the concern underneath. "Copy all, Unit 7. Weather Service shows the storm breaking within the hour. Highway crews are standing by to clear the road. Recovery and backup units will reach you as soon as conditions permit." Halvor Bixby arrived first, his massive wrecker punching through the drifts with the kind of brutal efficiency that made Odegaard want to kiss the man. The recovery operator pulled up beside Odegaard's vehicle and climbed down, his face invisible behind a face mask and goggles. "Hell of a night to be stuck out here," he said, his voice muffled. "Dispatch says you got something interesting in that trailer." Odegaard filled him in while they waited for the backup units, watched Halvor's expression shift from curiosity to grim understanding as the implications became clear. The hazmat team arrived an hour later, along with 2 more troopers and a supervisor who'd driven up from Fairbanks specifically for this. They documented the lab, photographed everything, and began the careful process of securing the chemicals for transport and disposal. The operation took most of the day, working in bitter cold that made every movement an effort. Odegaard gave his statement 3 separate times, each iteration focusing on different aspects of the incident, and by the time they were finished, he was so exhausted he could barely stand. The supervisor pulled him aside before they left. "Good work stopping them from burning this. Lab this size, we're talking millions of dollars in product over its operational lifetime. You probably disrupted a major distribution network." Odegaard nodded, too tired to feel much satisfaction. "Did anyone run the plate I called in?" The supervisor checked his notes. "Trailers registered to a shell company out of Anchorage. We're working it, but I wouldn't hold my breath. These operations are usually insulated pretty well." Odegaard drove back to Coldfoot in convoy with the other vehicles, the semi and its trailer being hauled by Halvor's wrecker. The road had been plowed, but the going was still slow, and he had plenty of time to think about the night he'd just survived. The figure with the jerry can was still out there, along with everyone else involved in the operation. They'd seen him, knew he'd found their lab, and would certainly adjust their operations in response. The convoy that had come in the night bothered him most. The coordination and resources suggested an organization with deep pockets and reach that extended into places law enforcement couldn't easily touch. Back at the station, he filed his reports and downloaded his phone's photos to the evidence server. Then he sat in the break room with coffee. He was too tired to drink and tried to shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. The lab had been sophisticated, well supplied, clearly operating for an extended period. But it had been abandoned at the first sign of law enforcement, left behind without even an attempt to defend it or negotiate. That suggested either enormous resources, or losing a single production facility was an acceptable cost of doing business, or something else. Something he was missing. Sila Aputi found him there an hour later. "You should go home, get some sleep. You've been up for more than 24 hours. Odegaard nodded, but didn't move. "Did you hear anything back on the plate?" She shook her head. "Shell company, like they said, but I ran the semi's VN through the database. It's registered to a trucking company that reported it stolen 3 weeks ago from a yard in Wasilla." That detail settled into place with the others, forming a pattern he didn't like. So they stole the truck, set up the lab in the trailer, and were running it mobile until something went wrong. "Looks that way," Silas said. "The question is what went wrong? Why abandon it in the middle of a blizzard instead of trying to ride out the storm somewhere less exposed?" Odegaard had been wondering the same thing. Maybe they saw me coming. Decided discretion was the better part of valor. But that didn't feel right. The truck had been positioned to block the road, which suggested either a breakdown or deliberate strategy, and the person who'd come back with the jerry can had been surprised to see the trailer open, which meant they hadn't known about Odegaard until after they'd abandoned the operation. The answer came 3 days later, when the lab's chemical inventory was fully documented and analyzed. Buried in the technical report was a detail that made Odegaard's blood run cold. One of the chemical containers showed evidence of a leak, a slow seepage that had been dripping onto the trailer's floor for what the hazmat team estimated was at least 12 hours before Odegaard arrived. The chemical in question was highly volatile, and its accumulation in an enclosed space with active heating elements created an explosion risk that increased exponentially over time. The people running the lab had abandoned it because they knew it was a bomb waiting to go off. Odegaard thought about that for a long time. Thought about opening the trailer doors and shining his light inside. About the hours he'd spent parked next to a potential explosion massive enough to vaporize his vehicle and himself. Thought about the convoy that had come in the night, seen the situation, and backed away rather than risk being caught in the blast. The margins between life and death up here were always thin, but he'd spent a night on the wrong side of that line without even knowing it. He never saw the person with the jerry can again, never got any leads on the convoy or the organization behind the lab. The investigation ran into the same walls that stopped most cases involving sophisticated criminal networks. Layers of corporate shells and cutouts that made prosecution nearly impossible without informants who were too scared to talk. The trailer and its contents were eventually destroyed according to hazmat protocols, the chemicals disposed of and the equipment reduced to scrap metal. The semi was returned to its owners, who claimed complete ignorance of how it had been stolen or used. Odegaard continued patrolling the Dalton, watching the miles roll past and keeping an eye out for abandoned vehicles or suspicious activity. But something had changed in him during that night in the storm. He found himself thinking about the calculations that people made, the decision to abandon valuable equipment rather than risk confrontation, the willingness to let him die in an explosion if it meant protecting their operation. He thought about the thin line of law enforcement stretched across thousands of square miles of empty country, and how inadequate it was against organizations with resources and ruthlessness that exceeded anything he'd been trained to handle. 6 months later, another mobile lab was found on the park's highway, abandoned in similar circumstances. Then another on the Richardson, and another on the Glen. The pattern was clear. They were moving the operations constantly, using stolen vehicles and staying mobile to avoid detection. Each lab that was found represented probably a dozen others that operated successfully, cooking their poison and distributing it across the state and beyond. Odegaard read the reports and recognized the same helpless feeling he'd had in the storm, the understanding that finding one lab changed nothing fundamental about the problem. On his last patrol before requesting a transfer to investigations, Odegaard stopped at mile 220 and sat looking at the spot where the semi had blocked the road. The snow had melted and refrozen countless times, erasing any trace of that night. But he remembered the smell, the chemical burn in his throat. The moment when he'd opened those trailer doors not knowing he was looking at something that could have killed him. He remembered the figure with the jerry can, turning in the snow, and the convoy's headlights appearing out of the storm like something from a nightmare. The wind picked up, driving ice crystals across the pavement, and Odegaard thought about all the vehicles that passed this spot every day. How many of them carried secrets, contraband, people running from or toward something that would never appear in any official record. The highway was just a road, neutral and indifferent, but it enabled flows of commerce and crime that were impossible to fully control or even comprehend. His job was to catch what he could, stop what was stoppable, and try not to think too hard about everything that slipped through. He pulled back onto the highway and continued north, into country where the road eventually ended and the wilderness began. Behind him, the sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of red and gold that would have been beautiful if he could forget what they reminded him of. Blood on ice, fire in the darkness, the things people did to each other when they thought no one was watching. The wind howled down from the mountains, and somewhere out there, another truck was rolling south with cargo that wouldn't match its manifest. Another operation was setting up or shutting down. Another line was being crossed that he'd never even know existed. The Dalton Highway stretched ahead, empty and waiting. and Shell Odegaard drove into the gathering dark with his headlights carving a tunnel through the cold. Behind him, the road disappeared, swallowed by distance and night. Ahead, it went on forever, leading to places he'd never reach and answers he'd never find. That was the job. That was what the North taught you, if you stayed long enough to learn. Some things you stopped, and some things you didn't. And the difference between them was mostly luck and timing, and being in the right place at the moment when wrong intersected with law. He'd been lucky once. The question was whether that luck would hold, or whether someday he'd open the wrong door at the wrong time and find something that wouldn't let him walk away. The thought stayed with him all the way back to Coldfoot, riding in the passenger seat like a ghost he couldn't shake. The station lights were warm and welcoming when he finally pulled into the lot, but they didn't chase away the cold that had settled into his bones. Some cold went deeper than weather. Some cold came from understanding things you wished you didn't know. The call came through at 1400 on a Tuesday in March, when the Yukon River ice was still thick enough to support a snow machine, but rotten enough that nobody with sense traveled it after dark. Trooper Ephraim Coldwell was 70 miles out of Galena when the dispatcher's voice crackled through his radio with coordinates for a village he'd visited twice before, both times for welfare checks that had turned into body recoveries. The village sat on the river's north bank, accessible only by air or water depending on the season. 23 families living in a cluster of plywood houses that looked like they'd been dropped onto the tundra and left to weather into the landscape. Coldwell acknowledged the call and banked his Cessna toward the coordinates, watching the river unroll beneath him like a frozen highway threading through spruce forests that stretched to every horizon. The message had been vague. A request for law enforcement presence to investigate concerns about missing persons, plural, which suggested either multiple incidents or a situation serious enough that locals had finally overcome their usual reluctance to involve outside authority. Villages this remote operated on their own codes and hierarchies, settling most problems internally through councils of elders and traditional dispute resolution methods that predated the state's legal system by centuries. When they called for a trooper, it meant something had exceeded their capacity to handle, or someone had violated norms so badly that outside intervention was the only acceptable response. Coldwell circled the village once before landing, noting details that his training had taught him to catalog automatically. Snow machines parked in clusters near several houses, suggesting gatherings or meetings in progress. Smoke rising from most chimneys, indicating normal occupancy levels. The airstrip clear of obstacles, recently maintained despite the lack of scheduled traffic. And, standing near the community building, a small group watching his approach with the kind of focused attention that suggested they'd been waiting for him specifically. He touched down on the packed snow, feeling the skis grab and settle, and taxied to the end of the strip before shutting down the engine. The silence after the propeller stopped was profound, broken only by the wind and the distant sound of dogs barking. Coldwell gathered his gear and climbed down, his boots crunching on snow that had been compacted by repeated traffic into a surface hard as concrete. The group from the community building was approaching, 3 men and a woman moving with the unhurried pace of people who'd lived their entire lives in a place where rushing meant nothing and patience was survival. The woman who reached him first introduced herself as Nuka Kayana, the village health aide. She was in her 50s, Coldwell guessed, with the weathered face and direct gaze of someone who'd seen enough of life's difficulties to be unfazed by a trooper's presence. "Thank you for coming. We have a situation that needs official documentation." Her English was precise, formally structured, the language of someone who'd been educated outside the village but had chosen to return. Coldwell shook her hand and gestured for her to continue. 3 people have gone missing in the last month. All of them were last seen near the river. Local searches have found nothing. She paused, choosing her words carefully. There are concerns about whether these disappearances are connected, and whether they represent criminal activity rather than accidents. Coldwell felt his interest sharpen. 3 missing persons in a village of maybe 150 people wasn't just unusual. It was statistically improbable unless there was a common factor connecting them. They walked to the community building where the village council had assembled along with family members of the missing. Coldwell set up his recorder and notepad, established the date and time and who was present, and began taking statements with the methodical thoroughness that investigation required. The first person to go missing was a young man named in the statements only as someone's nephew, last seen 3 weeks ago heading downriver on his snow machine to check trap lines. When he hadn't returned after 2 days, searchers had followed his trail and found the machine abandoned on the ice. Engine cold, no sign of the driver. The second disappearance was a woman in her 30s, gone missing while collecting water from a hole in the river ice near the village. Her bucket was found beside the hole, but she'd vanished as completely as though she'd never existed. The third case was the most disturbing because it had happened just 2 days ago, and there had been witnesses. A teenager had been traveling with friends on the river ice when he'd stopped to adjust his snow machine's track. The others had continued ahead, and when they'd looked back a minute later, he was gone. His machine was still there, still running, but the boy had disappeared. They'd searched immediately, expanding in concentric circles from the last known position, but found nothing. No tracks, no blood, no disturbed snow except what their own search had created. Coldwell listened to each account, asked questions, mapped out the locations on a chart of the river. The pattern that emerged was troubling because it suggested intention rather than accident. All 3 disappearances had occurred in a stretch of river about 5 miles long, all in areas where the ice was known to be stable, all during daylight hours or early evening when visibility was good. Random accidents wouldn't cluster like this. Whatever was happening had a geographic focus and possibly a temporal pattern that might reveal itself with more data. After the formal statements, Osric Van approached Coldwell privately. The elder was probably 80, bent with age, but still sharp-eyed and commanding in the quiet way that came from decades of respected leadership. "There's something you should know that won't go in any official record," he said, his voice low enough that only Coldwell could hear. "People are scared. Not just worried about the missing, but scared in a way I haven't seen in 50 years living here. They think something is hunting them." Coldwell kept his expression neutral. "What kind of something?" Osric's face was unreadable. "Different people have different ideas, but everyone agrees that the river isn't safe anymore, and whatever is out there knows this place and how we live." He paused, studying Coldwell's reaction. "I'm not asking you to believe in spirits or old stories. I'm telling you that people are changing their behavior based on fear, and that fear is real regardless of what's causing it." The health clinic was a single-room building attached to Nuka Kayana's house, equipped with basic medical supplies and a satellite link to doctors in Fairbanks who could provide consultation for emergencies. Nuka had offered to show Coldwell her records of the missing person's last medical visits, thinking there might be something in their health histories that could provide clues. Coldwell accepted, knowing it was unlikely but recognizing that investigation often meant following threads that led nowhere, accumulating negatives until the positives stood out by contrast. The files were thin, documenting routine care and minor injuries consistent with subsistence living in extreme conditions. But as Coldwell reviewed them, a detail caught his attention that Nuka confirmed when he asked. All 3 missing persons had visited the clinic within 2 weeks of their disappearances, complaining of symptoms that Nuka had documented as possible early-stage flu, fatigue, disorientation, headaches. She'd treated them with standard protocols and sent them home with instructions to return if symptoms worsened. None of them had returned because they'd disappeared before the follow-up visits could occur. Caldwell felt something shift in his understanding of the case. 3 people experiencing similar symptoms before vanishing wasn't proof of anything, but it suggested a possible connection worth exploring. Did anyone else in the village have similar symptoms during that time? Nuka consulted her records. Maybe half a dozen others, but their symptoms resolved normally within a few days. I attributed it to seasonal illness, something going around. She looked at Caldwell. You think the sickness and the disappearances are related? I think it's worth investigating, Caldwell said carefully. He didn't want to start rumors or create panic, but the pattern was too specific to ignore. 3 people getting sick, then disappearing from the same stretch of river within weeks of each other. Either it was an extraordinary coincidence, or there was a common factor that needed to be identified. Did any of them mention where they thought they'd caught the illness? Contact with anyone from outside the village, unusual activities, anything like that? Nuka shook her head slowly, then stopped. The nephew mentioned he'd been camping downriver, checking traps. Said he'd found a fishing camp someone had set up on the ice, abandoned but recently used. He'd sheltered there during a storm and thought maybe he'd picked up something from contaminated food someone had left behind. She pulled out a map and marked the location the nephew had described. Here, about 3 miles south of the village. We didn't think much of it at the time. Caldwell studied the map, noting that the fishing camp location was within the cluster of disappearances. Has anyone checked this camp since he mentioned it? Nuka's expression told him the answer before she spoke. No one goes downriver anymore. Not since the second disappearance. People are staying close to the village, traveling in groups, avoiding the ice altogether if they can. The decision to investigate the fishing camp felt inevitable, though Caldwell was acutely aware that doing so alone violated every safety protocol in his training. But waiting for backup that might not arrive for days wasn't acceptable when the pattern suggested more disappearances could occur. He requisitioned a snow machine from the village's emergency equipment cache, checked that his satellite phone was charged and his sidearm was accessible, and set out at first light the next morning with Osric's warning echoing in his mind. Something is hunting them. The river ice was a landscape of its own, pressure ridges and wind-sculpted drifts creating a terrain that looked almost lunar in its alienness. Caldwell followed the route marked on his map, navigating by GPS and visual landmarks that stood out against the white. A distinctive spruce cluster, a bend in the river's course, a rocky outcrop on the north bank. The temperature was -20, cold enough that his breath froze on his face mask and his eyes watered behind his goggles. The snow machine's engine was loud in the silence, and he found himself unconsciously scanning his surroundings for movement or anomaly, looking for whatever had put such fear into people who'd lived their entire lives in this unforgiving landscape. He found the fishing camp exactly where the nephew had described it, a small shelter constructed from spruce poles and a plastic tarp, positioned in the lee of a pressure ridge that provided some wind protection. The shelter was still standing, which suggested it hadn't been there too long, maybe a few weeks at most before weather and ice movement would have destroyed it. Caldwell stopped his machine 50 yards away and approached on foot, his hand resting on his sidearm more from instinct than any specific threat assessment. The camp showed signs of recent occupation but hasty abandonment. A cooking area with a propane stove still set up, food supplies in sealed containers, sleeping bags, and personal items scattered as though someone had left quickly without bothering to pack properly. Caldwell documented everything with his phone camera, noting details that might prove significant later. The food containers were commercial packaging, not local subsistence goods, suggesting whoever had been here was from outside the village. The sleeping bags were high-quality expedition gear, expensive and well-maintained. And there was equipment that didn't fit the pattern of a simple fishing camp. A portable generator, a laptop computer in a waterproof case, scientific instruments that Coldwell didn't recognize, but that suggested data collection rather than recreation. He was photographing the instrument cluster when his satellite phone rang. The sound so unexpected in the silence that he actually jumped. The screen showed Nuka's number. "Trooper Coldwell, I thought you should know. We just found tracks leading out of the village toward the river. Fresh tracks, maybe an hour old. One of the teenagers is missing. His family thought he was visiting friends, but no one's seen him since this morning." Coldwell felt his stomach clench. "Keep everyone away from the river. I'll be back within 30 minutes. He disconnected and looked around the camp with new urgency. Whatever was happening here, it was still active, still taking people. The abandoned equipment suggested the people running this camp had also disappeared or fled, leaving behind whatever operation they'd been conducting. Coldwell grabbed the laptop case and the most portable of the scientific instruments, knowing he was potentially contaminating a crime scene but judging that the evidence value outweighed protocol. The ride back to the village was a blur of speed and concentration, pushing the snow machine harder than was safe on ice that could conceal deadly flaws beneath its surface. Coldwell's mind raced through possibilities, trying to construct a narrative that explained the evidence. A research camp, abandoned suddenly. Missing villagers with symptoms suggesting exposure to something biological or chemical. A pattern of disappearances clustered around a specific geographic area. The pieces didn't quite fit together yet, but the outline of something deliberately harmful was becoming visible. The village was in controlled chaos when Coldwell arrived, search parties organizing despite his instruction to stay clear of the river. The missing teenager's family was demanding action, and Osric was struggling to maintain order while respecting both the family's grief and the need for caution. Coldwell pulled Nuka aside and showed her the equipment he'd recovered. "Do you recognize any of this? The scientific instruments. Do they look like anything you've seen before?" Nuka examined them carefully. "This one measures air quality, particulates and chemical concentrations. This one looks like it might be for water sampling. And this," she held up a device with a digital display, "I think this measures radiation." She looked at Coldwell. "What were they doing out there?" Before Coldwell could answer, one of the search party members came running from the river, shouting. The group had found something on the ice, and from the panic in the man's voice, it wasn't good. Coldwell and Nuka followed him back to the riverbank, where a cluster of people stood in a loose circle around something dark on the white ice. As they approached, the dark shape resolved into a person, lying face down, not moving. It was the missing teenager. He was unconscious but alive, his breathing shallow and his skin cold to the touch in a way that went beyond simple exposure. Nuka immediately began assessment, checking vitals and looking for injuries while Coldwell established a perimeter and started documenting the scene. The boy had been found only 100 yards from the village, in an area that search parties had covered multiple times in the past few hours. Either he'd been elsewhere and returned, or he'd been here all along and somehow invisible to the searchers. They moved him to the clinic, where Nuka's training took over and Coldwell was relegated to observer. The boy's symptoms were severe: hypothermia, disorientation, pupils that didn't respond properly to light. But there was something else, something Nuka noticed immediately and pointed out to Coldwell. "Look at his hands and face, this rash, these lesions. I've seen something similar before in cases of chemical exposure." She swabbed several of the lesions for analysis that would have to be sent to a real lab, then started treatment for what she could address with her limited supplies. Coldwell stepped outside to make calls. First to his supervisor, reporting the situation and requesting immediate backup and a medical evacuation for the teenager. then to the State Health Department, describing the symptoms and the abandoned research camp and requesting that someone with expertise in environmental hazards be included in the response. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if Coldwell had been able to appreciate anything beyond the urgency of the situation. The laptop he'd recovered from the fishing camp was password protected, but Coldwell had basic forensic training that included techniques for accessing locked devices. He worked on it while waiting for the medical evacuation, finally cracking the password and accessing files that made his earlier suspicions crystallize into something close to certainty. The laptop belonged to a research team, not affiliated with any university or government agency that Coldwell could identify from the materials, conducting what appeared to be environmental monitoring of the Yukon River watershed. But the data they were collecting went beyond normal research protocols. Water samples analyzed for contaminants, air quality measurements, radiation levels, all systematically documented with notes that suggested they were tracking the spread of something they'd introduced deliberately. One file contained correspondence between team members, discussing results and timeline and the need to maintain operational security. Another file held maps, overlaying the river system with colored zones that appeared to represent contamination levels or exposure risks. And buried in a subfolder was a document that made Coldwell's blood run cold. A risk assessment acknowledging that local populations might experience adverse effects from the research activities, but concluding that the scientific value outweighed the minimal danger to what the document termed non-essential personnel. Coldwell read that phrase 3 times, feeling anger build alongside professional detachment. Non-essential personnel. The document was referring to the village residents, to people like the missing nephew and the woman who'd disappeared collecting water and the teenager currently fighting for his life in the clinic. Whoever had been running this operation had known there were risks and had proceeded anyway, apparently calculating that the remote location and sparse population made the danger acceptable. The medical evacuation arrived just after dark, a helicopter from the regional hospital flying in conditions that were marginal at best. They loaded the teenager aboard along with Nuka's documentation of his symptoms and Coldwell's preliminary report. The pilot informed Coldwell that weather was deteriorating and he couldn't wait. They needed to lift off immediately. Coldwell watched the helicopter disappear into the darkness, its navigation lights blinking red and white, carrying the boy toward the treatment that might or might not be sufficient for whatever he'd been exposed to. The village gathered in the community building that night, and Coldwell briefed them on what he'd found. He was careful with his language, presenting facts without speculation, but the implications were clear enough that people drew their own conclusions. Someone had been using their river as a testing ground, had contaminated it with something that was making people sick and possibly causing the disappearances. The anger in the room was palpable, mixed with fear and a sense of betrayal that outside authorities had let this happen. Osric spoke for the group. What happens now? How do we know it's safe? How do we know there aren't more of these camps, more contamination? Coldwell had to admit he didn't have answers. The investigation would expand. More resources would be brought in. The contamination would be mapped and hopefully cleaned up. But all of that took time, and in the meantime, the village was living beside a river they could no longer trust. Over the next 3 days, the response team arrived in waves. Environmental specialists who took samples and measured levels and produced reports filled with technical language that boiled down to confirmation that, yes, the river was contaminated with a cocktail of experimental compounds that had no business being there. Law enforcement investigators who began the process of identifying the research team and building a case for whatever charges would be appropriate. And medical personnel who screened every village resident for exposure, finding elevated levels in most people, but severe symptoms in only the few who'd gone missing or been found unconscious. The pattern became clearer as data accumulated. The research team had been testing some kind of biological compound, possibly a prototype for environmental remediation or possibly something else entirely. The compound had interacted with natural river chemistry in unexpected ways, creating a hazard zone that moved with the current and accumulated in certain areas where ice formation or geography concentrated the contamination. People who'd spent time in those zones had been exposed to levels sufficient to cause the symptoms Nuka had documented. But that still didn't explain the disappearances themselves. The teenager who'd been found was able to provide some information once he'd recovered enough to talk, though his memories of the time he'd been missing were fragmented and unreliable. He remembered feeling sick, disoriented, wandering on the ice without clear purpose or direction. He remembered hallucinations, possibly induced by the contamination's neurological effects, seeing things that couldn't have been real, and he remembered someone finding him, helping him, leading him back toward the village before he'd lost consciousness. But he couldn't describe who it had been, or whether it had been real or another hallucination. The other missing persons weren't found, not in those first days or in the weeks of intensive search that followed. The contamination had been in the river for months before being detected. Plenty of time for affected individuals to wander into danger or fall through ice, or simply walk into the wilderness and be swallowed by the vastness. The official conclusion was that the disappearances were likely accidents. People made vulnerable by contamination-induced disorientation who'd succumbed to environmental hazards before they could be helped. Coldwell wasn't sure he believed that, but he had no evidence to support an alternative theory. The research team members had disappeared as thoroughly as the village's missing persons, their camp abandoned and their whereabouts unknown. Warrants were issued, but the identities in the laptop files might have been false, and the organization they'd claimed to represent didn't exist in any official database. Whoever they were, they'd covered their tracks well enough to evade immediate consequences. The river was declared off-limits pending decontamination, a process that would take years and might never be fully completed. The village received compensation that felt like an insult given what had been taken from them. Money from a government program designed for exactly these situations but calibrated for property damage rather than missing lives. Some families relocated, unable to continue living beside a river that had betrayed them. Others stayed, out of stubbornness, or love of place, or simple lack of alternatives. Coldwell filed his reports and moved on to other cases, but the Yukon investigation stayed with him in ways he couldn't entirely articulate. The callousness of using an entire community as unwitting test subjects. The ease with which people with resources could exploit the remote and vulnerable, and the lingering question of what had really happened to the missing. The official explanation felt incomplete, like a story with crucial pages torn out. Years later, working a different case in a different village, Coldwell heard a rumor that made him think about the Yukon disappearances in a new light. Someone had seen people matching the descriptions of the missing research team members, living under different names in a compound in the lower 48, still conducting research for an organization that operated in the shadows between legitimate science and something darker. The rumor was impossible to verify, and even if true, didn't prove anything about their activities or motives. But it suggested that whatever had been tested on the Yukon River had been valuable enough to the people behind it that they'd protected their researchers, extracted them when the operation was compromised, and probably continued their work elsewhere. That someone, somewhere, had decided that the contamination and the disappearances and the suffering were acceptable prices for whatever knowledge or capability they'd gained. Coldwell never returned to that village on the Yukon, though he followed news about it through official channels and occasional conversations with Nuka Kayana, who'd stayed and continued her work despite everything. The community had survived, adapted, found ways to live with the knowledge that the river they'd depended on for generations could no longer be fully trusted. The teenage boy had recovered physically, though Nuka reported he was changed, quieter, prone to staring at the river with an expression she couldn't read. The missing were never found, officially declared dead after the waiting period required by law. Their families held services without bodies, said goodbye to people who'd vanished as completely as if they'd never existed. And life continued because that was what survival demanded. Moving forward despite the holes left by absence, despite the questions that would never be answered. On his last conversation with Osric Van before the elder passed away, Coldwell had asked him directly whether he believed the official explanation for the disappearances. The old man had been silent for a long time before answering. I believe people saw what they saw and felt what they felt. I believe the river took those people, whether through contamination or ice or something else, and I believe there are things that happen in this country that never get properly explained, because the people who could explain them don't care enough to try. That answer stayed with Coldwell longer than any of the official reports, longer than the technical analyses of contamination levels and exposure pathways. It captured something fundamental about the case that the bureaucratic language couldn't touch, the sense that vulnerable people had been harmed by those with power, and the mechanisms theoretically designed to prevent such harm had failed completely. He kept the laptop from the fishing camp, stored in evidence long after the case was officially closed. Occasionally, he'd review the files, looking for details he might have missed, connections that might reveal who the research team had really been or what they'd truly been testing. He never found anything definitive, just layers of obfuscation that suggested professional skill at hiding identities and intentions. The maps in the laptop files showed contamination zones extending far beyond the immediate area of the village, following the river's course for hundreds of miles. Coldwell had reported this to the appropriate agencies, but cleanup efforts had focused on the area around the village, leaving the rest unaddressed due to resource constraints and the practical impossibility of decontaminating a river system that vast, which meant that whatever had been introduced into the Yukon was still out there, diluted perhaps, but persistent, flowing downstream toward communities and ecosystems that would never know they'd been touched by someone else's reckless experiment. That knowledge weighed on Coldwell in moments of quiet reflection. The understanding that the case he'd investigated was just one visible incident in a pattern of exploitation that remained mostly invisible. That for every contamination event that got discovered and documented, there were probably dozens that went unnoticed or were successfully concealed. The North was vast and empty enough that motivated people with resources could conduct almost any activity they wanted, secure in the knowledge that oversight was minimal and consequences uncertain. He'd joined law enforcement with ideals about justice and protection, believing that the system worked more often than it failed. Cases like the Yukon disappearances had complicated that belief without entirely destroying it. The system had responded when called, had investigated and documented and tried to make things right. But the response had been too slow and too limited, had failed to prevent the harm or fully address its causes, and the people responsible had escaped any real accountability. Nuka Kayana sent him a message on the 5th anniversary of the first disappearance. The village was holding a memorial, and she thought he might want to know. Coldwell didn't attend, couldn't face the families whose questions he'd never been able to answer fully, but he stood by the river that day and thought about the people who'd vanished, wondered whether they'd died quickly or suffered, whether they'd understood what was happening to them or had been too confused by contamination-induced hallucinations to comprehend their situation, whether anyone had tried to help them or they'd been alone at the end. The river flowed past, indifferent and eternal, carrying its secrets toward the sea. Somewhere downstream, the contamination persisted, invisible but present, a hidden legacy of choices made by people who'd never faced consequences. Somewhere, The missing persons' stories had ended in ways no investigation had revealed, their final moments unknown to anyone who'd cared about them. Ephraim Coldwell watched the water move and felt the weight of all the things he hadn't been able to fix, all the answers he hadn't found, all the justice he hadn't delivered. The North taught you that lesson eventually, if you stayed long enough. That some questions don't get answered, that some wrongs don't get righted. That the best you could do was bear witness and remember and try to prevent the next tragedy, knowing you'd probably fail, but trying anyway, because the alternative was accepting that vulnerable people were disposable and their suffering didn't matter. He turned away from the river finally, walked back to his vehicle, and drove toward wherever the next call would take him. Behind him, the Yukon flowed on, keeping its secrets, carrying its poison, waiting for the next person who trusted enough to let their guard down. The water didn't care. The water never cared. That was the most terrible thing he'd learned. Nature itself was neutral, and the harm came from people who exploited that neutrality, who understood that a river couldn't testify and the dead couldn't accuse, and the remote places of the world were perfect for crimes that no one would witness or investigate or remember. Except Ephraim Coldwell remembered. He'd carry those missing faces with him for whatever remained of his career, and probably beyond. 3 people who'd disappeared from beside a river that should have sustained them, taken by contamination or misadventure, or something he'd never fully understand. The official files were closed, but the case would never really end. Not for him, not for the families, not for anyone who'd lived through it and learned that safety was an illusion and trust was a luxury the powerful could violate without fear. The engine turned over and he pulled onto the highway, leaving the river behind but carrying its weight forward into whatever came next. The smoke reached Torrin Blackwater before the flames did, a smell that slipped through the cracked window of his truck like something living, searching. He'd been parked outside the all-night diner on the Kenai Spur Highway, finishing paperwork that should have been done hours ago, when the first wisps of it curled through the cab. Acrid and wrong, carrying undertones of burning plastic and diesel and something else he couldn't immediately place. He looked up from his laptop and saw the glow on the horizon, orange against black clouds that hung low over the inlet like a shroud. Another fire, the 4th in 6 weeks. His coffee went cold in his hand as he started the engine. The harbor was chaos when he arrived 20 minutes later. Volunteer firefighters running hoses toward a pier where flames were consuming what had been a 40-foot seiner. The heat hit him when he opened the truck door, a physical wave that made his eyes water and his skin prickle. But it was the sound that stopped him. A roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, drowning out shouted commands and the diesel rumble of fire pumps. The boat was burning with an intensity that suggested something beyond accident, beyond even simple arson. This was destruction with purpose, methodical and complete. Mirek Sokolov found him in the crowd, the harbor master's face streaked with soot and reflecting firelight that made him look decades older. "Same as the others," he said, his voice hoarse from smoke. "Stripped clean before it burned. No gear, no electronics, nothing. Just the hull and enough accelerant to make sure there's nothing left to investigate." He pointed toward the burning vessel, but this time, someone was watching. Standing right there on the dock when the fire started, making sure it took properly before they left. Blackwater felt his pulse quicken. "Anyone get a description?" Mirek shook his head. Too much smoke, too much confusion. But Anana saw something. "She's over there. Won't talk to anyone else." He gestured toward a woman standing apart from the main crowd, her face illuminated by flames that made her expression unreadable. "She's scared, Torrin. Really scared. More than just witness nerves." Anana Tulugak was shaking when Blackwater approached, though the night wasn't particularly cold. She worked at one of the processing plants, he knew, spent her days in blood and ice and the endless repetition of gutting fish. But there was something in her eyes now that went beyond the usual weariness of seasonal work. "I shouldn't tell you this," she said before he could speak. "I'm leaving anyway, got a job in Anchorage, moving next week. But you need to know what's happening here." She described seeing someone on the boat 2 hours before the fire, loading containers into a white panel van with movements that were quick and practiced. The person had worn coveralls and a hood that concealed their face, but their body language had been wrong somehow, purposeful in a way that made Anana watch from the shadows of the processing plant. "They looked around before they left," she said. "Not like someone checking for witnesses, but like someone making sure the area was clear for what came next. And when they drove away, they didn't use headlights until they reached the highway." Blackwater wrote down every detail, but his mind was already racing ahead to implications. 4 fires in 6 weeks, all following the same pattern. Boats stripped and burned. Owners who'd been in financial trouble or had fallen behind on moorage fees. And now a witness who'd seen someone preparing a vessel for destruction with the kind of careful attention that suggested professional work. This wasn't random vandalism or insurance fraud. This was systematic, organized, and getting bolder. "There's something else," Anana said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "People are saying the fires aren't about money. They're saying it's punishment. That there's someone collecting payments from fishermen who work certain waters, and boats that don't pay or that talk to authorities end up burning." She met his eyes. "I'm telling you this because I'm leaving. Because I won't be here when whoever's doing this finds out someone talked. But you should know that people are terrified, not just worried about their boats, but scared for their families, their lives." The fire was contained by midnight, leaving behind wreckage that still smoldered and hissed when water hit the hottest spots. Blackwater stayed at the scene long after the crowds dispersed, watching the ruins and thinking about patterns. 4 fires, 4 boats, 4 owners who'd all been involved in the fishing industry's gray markets. Illegal catches sold for cash. Smuggled goods brought ashore in holds that were never inspected. Services provided to people who operated outside official channels. The boats had been connected to activities that existed in the gaps between law and commerce, and now they were gone, reduced to charred metal and ash. Myrick joined him as dawn approached, both men watching the inlet turn from black to gray as thin light filtered through persistent clouds. "I pulled the files on all 4 vessels," the harbor master said, handing over a folder thick with documents. "Every one of them had recent activity that doesn't match their official status. This signer was supposedly laid up for mechanical work, but I've got 3 different people who saw it going out last week, coming back loaded, offloading at night when no one official was around to see." Blackwater flipped through the documents, seeing the pattern Myrick described. Vessels in financial difficulty, supposedly inactive, but clearly operating outside normal channels. What were they moving? Myrick's silence was answer enough. The inlet had always been a conduit for things that didn't appear on manifests, goods and services that connected the fishing industry to markets that preferred to remain invisible. And now someone was burning the boats that facilitated those connections, either to eliminate competition or to enforce compliance with demands that boat owners couldn't or wouldn't meet. He spent the next hours reviewing harbor records in Myrick's cramped office, looking for connections that might reveal who was behind the fires. The data was fragmentary, incomplete in ways that suggested either poor record-keeping or deliberate obfuscation. But certain patterns emerged. Multiple vessels with the same mailing addresses, ownership structures buried behind corporate shells, clusters of activity that coincided with known smuggling seasons. Someone had been organizing illegal operations through the harbor for years, and the fires were part of that system, enforcement mechanisms that kept participants compliant and silent. His phone rang at 3 in the morning, pulling him from documents that had started to blur together. The number was blocked, and when he answered, the voice on the other end was distorted by electronic modification that made it sound inhuman. "Stop investigating the harbor fires." The words were delivered without inflection, a statement of fact rather than a threat. "This is the only warning you'll receive." The line went dead before Blackwater could respond. He sat in the darkness of Myrick's office, listening to his own breathing and the distant sound of water against pier pilings. The call had been expected on some level, but experiencing it was different from anticipating it. Someone was watching his investigation, tracking his movements closely enough to know he was getting close to something they wanted protected. The question was whether the warning was meant to deter or to establish documentation before escalation to violence. Myrick had fallen asleep in his chair, exhausted by the night's events, and Blackwater didn't wake him. Instead, he stepped outside into air that was cold and damp with fog rolling in from the inlet. The harbor was quiet, boats rocking gently in their slips, everything appearing normal and peaceful. But underneath that surface calm was something predatory, patient, and willing to burn boats and make threatening calls to enforce compliance with demands that remained unspoken. He drove north from Kenai as sunrise approached, following the route a white panel van would have taken, looking for locations where it might have stopped. The highway ran through industrial zones and residential areas, past warehouses and storage facilities that catered to the fishing industry. Most were closed for the winter, their parking lots empty and their buildings dark. But one location showed signs of recent activity despite being officially vacant. A fish processing plant that had closed 2 years ago, with fresh tire tracks in gravel and snow disturbed around loading docks. Blackwater established surveillance from a distance, watching the building through binoculars as dawn gave way to morning. Nothing moved for the first hour. No vehicles approached. No lights appeared in windows. But the building had the feel of a place being used, subtle signs that suggested recent human presence. He documented the location with photographs and GPS coordinates, building a record that would support whatever actions came next. Movement caught his eye at 700 hours, a pickup truck pulling around to the building's rear. 2 men emerged, both wearing fishing gear, and began unloading containers from the truck bed. Blackwater photographed them, zooming in to capture faces and license plates, watching as they worked with the efficiency of people who'd done this many times before. The containers went inside through a loading dock door that opened from within, suggesting someone else was already in the building. The entire operation took 15 minutes. Then the truck was gone, heading back toward the highway. He waited another hour before approaching on foot, his hand resting on his sidearm more from instinct than any specific threat assessment. The loading dock had a roll-up door with gaps large enough to see through, and what he saw made his breath catch. The building's interior had been converted into a storage facility with containers stacked in organized rows and a processing area set up for repacking goods. The scale suggested months of operation, maybe longer, and the organization spoke to resources that exceeded what casual criminals could deploy. His radio crackled with a call from dispatch, a routine check-in that he acknowledged with coordinates and a brief status update. But as he stepped back from the building, something made him turn. A figure was standing at the tree line 50 yards away, watching him. Too far to make out details, but close enough that their attention was unmistakable. Blackwater raised his hand in acknowledgement, a gesture that could have been greeting or challenge, and the figure melted back into the trees without responding. The encounter lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it confirmed what the threatening call had suggested. He was being watched, his investigation monitored with attention to detail that was deeply concerning. Whoever was behind the fires had resources sufficient to maintain surveillance on law enforcement, to track movements and assess threats with a level of organization that went far beyond simple criminal opportunism. He called for backup, knowing it would take time to arrive but unwilling to approach the building alone when he knew hostile parties were monitoring his actions. While waiting, he maintained observation from a position that provided cover and clear sightlines to all approaches. The morning was quiet. Fog still thick enough to muffle sound and reduce visibility. The kind of weather where things could happen without being seen or heard, where violence could occur in silence and isolation. The backup arrived 40 minutes later. 2 troopers from Soldatna, who'd been briefed on the situation and approached with appropriate caution. Together, they secured the building's perimeter and requested a search warrant, then waited while prosecutors and judges were contacted and legal processes ground forward with bureaucratic slowness. The wait was tense, knowing that whoever was inside might be destroying evidence or escaping through routes that weren't visible from their positions. The warrant came through at noon, and they made entry with weapons drawn and voices announcing law enforcement presence. The building was empty of people, but the evidence was substantial. Containers filled with frozen fish packed in ways that suggested illegal harvest. Documentation showing a sophisticated operation buying unreported catch from struggling fishermen. Financial records tracking payments and deliveries across a network that extended throughout the region. And in a locked office at the building's rear, they found something that transformed the investigation from fishery violations into something far darker. The office contained files on individual boat owners, detailed dossiers that included photographs and personal information and assessments of financial vulnerability. Some files were marked with notations that corresponded to the boats that had burned, annotations that referenced non-compliance and correction required, in language that was bureaucratic but unmistakable in its implications. This wasn't just smuggling or illegal fishing. This was systematic extortion backed by arson, a protection racket that had been operating for years while maintaining the appearance of legitimate commerce. Blackwater photographed every page, documented every container, and tried to process the scale of what they'd discovered. The operation wasn't limited to Kenai. The files showed activities throughout Alaska's coastal communities, a network that moved illegal product through channels that law enforcement had been largely unaware of. The 4 fires weren't isolated incidents. They were visible manifestations of enforcement actions that occurred regularly across the network, punishments delivered to boat owners who failed to comply with demands or who became liabilities through cooperation with authorities. His phone rang again as they were completing the initial evidence inventory. The same blocked number, the same distorted voice. "You were warned, now there will be consequences." The call disconnected, and within seconds his radio was crackling with reports from dispatch. His personal truck, parked at the trooper post in Kenai, had been firebombed. The vehicle was destroyed, and the message was clear. The threat hadn't been empty, and whoever had made it could reach him whenever they wanted. The firebombing brought federal involvement, FBI and ATF agents arriving with resources and expertise that exceeded what state troopers could deploy. The investigation expanded rapidly, following financial trails and conducting raids on locations across Alaska and into the Pacific Northwest. But even as arrests were made and evidence accumulated, Blackwater felt the situation slipping beyond his ability to comprehend fully. The network was larger than he'd imagined, more deeply embedded in legitimate commerce, and protected by layers of legal insulation that made prosecuting leadership difficult, despite overwhelming evidence of criminal activity. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of interviews and evidence processing and coordination meetings. Blackwater worked 18-hour shifts, surviving on coffee and adrenaline, and the momentum of investigation that had taken on its own life. But underneath the professional focus was a growing awareness that he'd crossed a threshold from which there was no returning. He'd made enemies who wouldn't forget, who had demonstrated both capability and willingness to use violence against law enforcement. and who would be watching him for years to come regardless of how the investigation concluded. Ananatulugaq left for Anchorage before the arrests began, disappearing into the anonymity of the city with contact information that she made clear was for emergencies only. Her testimony would be needed eventually, but for now she was safer maintaining distance from anything connected to the investigation. Blackwater respected her decision while regretting that the system offered so little protection to witnesses who took enormous risks to provide crucial information. Mirek Sokolov received his own threats after the processing plant raid became public knowledge. Anonymous calls describing his daily routines in detail that proved surveillance had been ongoing. Messages suggesting that cooperation with law enforcement carried consequences that official protection couldn't prevent. The harbor master installed security systems and began varying his routes, adopting precautions that changed his life in fundamental ways, while the people who'd threatened him remained free and operational despite the arrests. The investigation revealed connections that extended beyond Alaska, linking the harbor fires to organized crime networks in the Pacific Northwest and beyond. The seafood industry had been penetrated by criminal enterprises that used legitimate business structures to move illegal product and launder proceeds, operations that had been running for years while remaining largely invisible to regulatory oversight. The fires were enforcement mechanisms within that system, disciplinary actions that maintained compliance through fear and demonstrated consequences. But even as the scope became clear, Blackwater struggled with the awareness that prosecution would be incomplete. The people at the operational level could be arrested and charged, but the organizational leadership remained insulated behind corporate structures and legal representation that would prevent direct accountability. The investigation would disrupt the network, might even dismantle significant portions of it, but the underlying infrastructure and relationships would persist, ready to be reconstituted once attention moved elsewhere. Weeks passed in a cycle of investigation and documentation, building cases that prosecutors said were strong, but which Blackwater knew would face challenges in court. Defense attorneys were already positioning their clients as low-level employees following orders, as people who had no knowledge of the broader criminal enterprise, as individuals who'd made mistakes but didn't deserve the sentences their actions would ordinarily warrant. The legal system ground forward with its own logic, and Blackwater found himself increasingly peripheral to processes that he'd initiated but no longer controlled. He returned to the harbor on a night when fog had reduced visibility to almost nothing, walking the piers and thinking about the boats that had burned and the people who'd been terrorized and the investigation that had consumed months of his life. The water was invisible beyond a few feet, but he could hear it moving, patient and indifferent to everything that happened on its shores. The inlet had been here long before the fires and would remain long after, a constant against which human dramas played out and were forgotten. Something moved in the fog ahead, a shape that could have been human or could have been a trick of limited visibility. Blackwater stopped, his hand moving to his sidearm while his eyes strained to identify what he'd seen. The shape didn't move again, and after a moment he continued forward, telling himself it was nothing, just nerves and exhaustion creating threats from shadows. But his pulse was elevated, and his awareness heightened, and he knew that the fear was real regardless of whether this particular threat was. He found Mirek at the harbor master's office, reviewing security footage from cameras that had been installed after the fourth fire. The footage showed the harbor at night, empty piers and dark water, and occasional movement that was always explained by wind or animals or boats shifting in their moorings. But Mirek was watching something specific, rewinding and replaying a segment that showed the pier where the fourth fire had occurred. "Look at this," he said, pointing at the screen. "This is from 2 nights ago, around 0300. Watch the edge of the frame." Blackwater leaned closer, studying the grainy footage. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then a figure appeared at the screen's edge, standing motionless and appearing to watch the pier. The figure was there for maybe 10 seconds before disappearing back into darkness, and the footage continued showing empty pier and quiet water. "Could be anyone," Blackwater said, but he didn't believe it. The figure's posture, the way it had stood watching before leaving, felt intentional in a way that random passers-by didn't. Someone was still watching the harbor, maintaining surveillance even after the raids and arrests, and the implications were deeply unsettling. The investigation had disrupted the network but hadn't eliminated it. And those who remained free were apparently monitoring the situation, assessing whether law enforcement's attention would persist or eventually fade. Mirek ran the footage forward, showing similar appearances over several nights, always around the same time, always the same general location, always the same pattern of appearing and watching and then disappearing. "I've started sleeping here," he admitted. "Can't shake the feeling that something's building, that whoever this is isn't just watching but planning something." His exhaustion was visible, the kind that came from weeks of insufficient sleep and constant vigilance. Blackwater knew the feeling, had been experiencing it himself since the firebombing. The hypervigilance that made relaxation impossible, the constant scanning for threats, the inability to trust that any moment was truly safe. It was corrosive and unsustainable, a state of permanent emergency that depleted resources faster than they could be replenished. But stepping down from that alertness felt like inviting the disaster that vigilance was preventing, creating an impossible bind that had no good resolution. They sat in silence for a while, watching the security feed cycle through its cameras, showing different angles of the quiet harbor. Everything appeared normal. Boats secured and piers empty and no sign of the threats they both knew existed. But normalcy had become suspect, a facade that could conceal preparation for violence, and neither man could fully accept the apparent calm. "I've been thinking about leaving," Mirek said eventually. "Retiring early, moving somewhere that doesn't have harbors or boats or any of this." He gestured vaguely at the screens. "But that feels like letting them win, like abandoning everyone who's counting on me to maintain security." The conflict was visible in his expression, duty warring with the self-preservation in ways that had no clear resolution. Blackwater understood the impulse, had entertained similar thoughts about requesting transfer to somewhere far from the inlet and its dark waters. But leaving also meant abandoning people who'd trusted him. Fishermen who'd provided information despite the risks, communities that were counting on law enforcement to maintain presence, even when that presence was clearly inadequate to the threats being faced. The mathematics didn't work, the costs of staying exceeded what could reasonably be demanded, but the costs of leaving were also unacceptable. His phone rang, startling both men despite the mundane normality of the sound. An unknown number, local area code, and Blackwater felt his pulse spike as he answered. But the voice wasn't distorted this time, was instead familiar in ways that took him a moment to place. Anana Tulugak, calling from Anchorage with information she'd encountered accidentally and felt compelled to report despite the risks. She'd recognized people connected to the network while working her new job, had overheard conversations that suggested they were planning something significant in Kenai. The specifics were unclear, but the tone had been urgent, and the timeline suggested action was imminent. Blackwater took down every detail, his mind already racing through implications and response options. If the network was planning retaliation or escalation, law enforcement needed to be prepared, but preparation required resources and justification that might not be available based on overheard fragments of conversation. He briefed federal agents who were coordinating the ongoing investigation, shared Anana's information, and the security footage Mirek had collected. The response was professional but measured. acknowledgement that the threats were credible, but uncertainty about how to allocate limited resources against dangers that remained largely theoretical. Surveillance would be increased, patrols enhanced, but the fundamental vulnerability remained. The network knew the terrain better than law enforcement did, had more patience and potentially more resources, and could choose when and where to act while law enforcement had to defend everywhere simultaneously. The waiting that followed was excruciating, days passing without incident while tension built toward levels that felt unsustainable. Blackwater found himself unable to sleep for more than a few hours at a time, waking with adrenaline surges triggered by sounds that were always explained by mundane causes. The exhaustion was cumulative, degrading his judgment and effectiveness in ways he recognized but couldn't effectively counter. Professional counseling helped somewhat, providing frameworks for managing stress, but the fundamental situation remained unchanged, and the pressure continued building. 3 nights after Anana's call, the harbor's security system detected movement on the same pier where the 4th fire had occurred. Multiple cameras captured figures approaching from the waterside, moving with coordination that suggested military or professional training. Blackwater was monitoring the feeds from Mirek's office when the alert came through, and he initiated response protocols while watching the figures move efficiently toward boats that were moored in the area most vulnerable to fire. Law enforcement response was immediate, but the figures had planned for it, dispersing when patrol vehicles arrived and disappearing into the darkness before they could be intercepted. The boats they'd approached were searched thoroughly, revealing accelerant containers that had been placed but not yet ignited. The intended arson had been prevented, but the message was clear. The network retained operational capability and willingness to use it. The investigation hadn't eliminated the threat, and future attacks were inevitable unless something fundamental changed. Blackwater stood on the pier as dawn approached, looking at the accelerant containers that had been photographed and collected as evidence. They'd been lucky this time. Surveillance had detected the attempt early enough for intervention, but luck wasn't strategy, and relying on it invited eventual failure. The network would learn from this attempt, would adjust their methods and try again, and eventually they would succeed unless law enforcement could shift from reactive response to proactive disruption. But proactive disruption required penetrating the network, developing informants who could provide advance warning of planned actions. And recruiting informants meant asking people to take enormous risks for uncertain protection, to betray organizations that had demonstrated willingness to use violence against those who cooperated with authorities. The ethics troubled Blackwater more than the tactics, the awareness that he was asking others to assume dangers he couldn't adequately protect them from. Federal agents arrived to process the scene, and Blackwater found himself relegated to observer status as they took control of the investigation. His role was becoming increasingly peripheral, the case expanding beyond state law enforcement capacity into federal jurisdiction with resources and authorities that exceeded what he could deploy. The transition was professionally appropriate, but personally frustrating. Watching work he'd initiated being taken over by people who didn't have the same investment in the community or understanding of the local dynamics. Mirek joined him as the sun rose over the inlet, both men watching agents work with methodical efficiency. "They're going to solve this," the harbor master said, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "They'll make arrests and dismantle parts of the network and declare victory, and then they'll leave, and we'll still be here with whoever's left and whatever comes next." The assessment was cynical, but probably accurate. A recognition that federal interventions were temporary while the threats were permanent. The weeks that followed saw additional arrests as investigation expanded, more defendants charged, and more evidence seized. But the core leadership remained elusive, protected by legal structures and operational security that frustrated investigators. Some progress was being made, the network was being degraded, But elimination remained beyond reach, and the organizational knowledge would persist even if individual members were imprisoned. Blackwater threw himself into the work, documenting evidence and conducting interviews and building cases that prosecutors would eventually present. But underneath the professional focus was growing awareness that this investigation wouldn't end with the kind of closure that made satisfying narratives. There would be no moment when all defendants were arrested and all threats eliminated and communities could return to normal. Instead, there would be gradual degradation of the network's capabilities, temporary disruption followed by eventual reconstitution, and ongoing low-level conflict that consumed resources while producing results that were always incomplete. The realization was demoralizing in ways he struggled to articulate. He'd entered law enforcement believing that solving cases meant eliminating problems, that prosecuting criminals made communities safer in lasting ways. But experience was revealing a more complex reality where victories were temporary and defeats were often invisible, where the best outcomes were marginal improvements rather than transformative change. The work remained necessary, but its limitations were increasingly apparent. Months passed in cycles of investigation and documentation, the case files growing thicker while the network proved resilient despite pressure. Some defendants accepted plea agreements and provided testimony, but the information they offered was carefully calibrated to minimize their own exposure while protecting higher-level members. The cooperation was strategically calculated rather than genuine, another form of manipulation that investigators recognized but couldn't effectively counter. Blackwater found himself thinking about the boats that had burned, about the fires that had initiated this entire investigation. 4 vessels destroyed, 4 families affected, 4 data points in a pattern that extended far beyond what was immediately visible. The fires had been symptoms rather than the disease itself, manifestations of a system that operated largely unseen until it produced spectacular violence. And stopping the fires hadn't meant eliminating the system, just forcing it to be more careful about how it enforced compliance. Late one night, he returned to the harbor alone, walking piers that were quiet and dark. The fog had returned, thick enough that boats were invisible beyond a few feet, and sound was muffled into near silence. He stood where the 4th fire had burned, looking at the pier that had been repaired, but which still showed scorch marks on pilings that hadn't been replaced. The physical evidence was fading, but the memory remained sharp, and with it, the awareness of how much effort had been expended for results that felt increasingly inadequate. Something moved in the fog ahead, and Blackwater tensed before recognizing Mirek's silhouette. The harbor master approached without speaking, and they stood together looking at water they couldn't see but could hear moving against the pilings. "Can't sleep anymore," Mirek said eventually. "Keep thinking about the figure in the security footage, wondering if they're out there watching right now." Blackwater nodded, understanding the paranoia because he felt it himself. The awareness of being watched, of threats that remained active despite the investigation, had become a constant presence that colored every moment. "We did what we could," he said. But the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. They disrupted the network, made arrests, prevented some fires, but the fundamental situation remained largely unchanged, and everyone involved knew it. "I'm retiring at the end of the month," Mirek announced. "Can't do this anymore. The stress is killing me faster than any actual threat would." He paused. "Whoever they bring in to replace me won't have the history, won't know the patterns, and the network will recognize that and exploit it." The statement was matter of fact, recognition of reality rather than criticism of his successor. Blackwater felt the comment as a judgment on his own choices, an implicit question about how long he could sustain this level of engagement before it consumed him entirely. The answer was that he was already approaching that threshold, already feeling the erosion of mental and emotional resources that stress demanded. But he had no clear path away from the work, No alternative that felt acceptable when communities were still vulnerable and threats remained active. They parted without further conversation, each heading toward vehicles and whatever sleep might be possible. Blackwater drove through empty streets, checking his mirrors reflexively and scanning for vehicles that might be following. The hypervigilance had become automatic, a constant background process that never fully shut down. He recognized it as unsustainable, but couldn't identify how to reduce the vigilance without inviting the dangers it was supposed to prevent. His apartment felt less like refuge than temporary shelter, a place he occupied between shifts rather than somewhere he actually lived. The personal items were minimal, photographs and furniture that suggested someone who'd never fully moved in despite living there for years. The transience felt appropriate somehow, matching the provisional nature of his entire situation. He existed in suspended state, waiting for resolution that might never come while the investigation ground forward with its own momentum. Sleep was difficult and fragmented when it came, interrupted by dreams of burning boats and figures in fog and voices delivering warnings through distorted phones. The dreams blurred with reality in ways that were disorienting, waking moments bleeding into sleep states until he sometimes wasn't certain which was which. The psychological toll was accumulating faster than he could process it, and professional counseling could only address symptoms without changing the fundamental situation creating them. Weeks turned into months, and the investigation's intensity gradually decreased as federal resources were redirected to other priorities. The network had been damaged but not destroyed, and investigators recognized that complete elimination was probably impossible given the resources available and the geographical scope involved. A kind of equilibrium had been established, an uneasy balance where the network operated more cautiously while law enforcement maintained heightened vigilance, both sides accepting a stalemate that neither could decisively break. Blackwater found himself in a meeting with his supervisor, discussing the investigation's status and what came next. The supervisor was professional and supportive, acknowledging the work that had been done while also noting that indefinite continuation at current intensity wasn't sustainable. Resources needed to be allocated to other cases, and Blackwater's obsessive focus on the harbor investigation was creating imbalance in the district's overall enforcement posture. The message was clear: time to scale back, to accept what had been achieved, and move on to other priorities. The directive was reasonable from institutional perspective, but it felt like abandonment of communities that remained vulnerable, and fishermen who'd cooperated despite risks. Scaling back meant reducing surveillance that might detect future arson attempts, meant decreasing the law enforcement presence that deterred the network's activities, meant accepting that some fires would probably burn because resources weren't available to prevent them. The calculations made sense from resource management perspective, but felt morally indefensible when translated into human costs. He complied with the directive because refusing would have been insubordination, but the decision sat heavily on him as he reduced his hours and shifted attention to other cases. The harbor remained part of his patrol area, but the intensive focus was gone, replaced by periodic check-ins and reactive response to incidents rather than proactive investigation of threats. The transition felt like failure, even though it was being presented as successful conclusion of a major investigation. Myrick's replacement arrived, and Blackwater briefed him on the situation, walking him through the history and explaining the patterns and warning about threats that remained active. The new harbor master listened attentively and took notes, but Blackwater could see that the information was being processed as historical background rather than current threat assessment. The new person hadn't lived through the fires and investigations, hadn't felt the fear that permeated the fishing community, and couldn't fully appreciate the ongoing danger despite Blackwater's attempts to convey its reality. Within months, The harbor's security posture had degraded as the new harbormaster made decisions prioritizing convenience over vigilance. Camera systems that Mirak had installed weren't maintained properly. Patrols that had been increased were scaled back, and the heightened awareness that had characterized operations during the investigation faded into normal routines. Blackwater watched it happen and felt powerless to prevent it. His warnings noted but not heeded by people who hadn't experienced what made them necessary. The network recognized the opportunity and began carefully testing the reduced security, conducting small probing actions that assessed how quickly law enforcement would respond and how thoroughly incidents would be investigated. Nothing rose to the level of the previous arsons, but the pattern suggested preparation for future escalation, groundwork being laid for operations that would occur when conditions were optimal. Blackwater documented what he observed and reported it through channels, but the response was measured and restrained. The threats were acknowledged but considered manageable through normal enforcement rather than requiring the intensive focus that had characterized the investigation. Resources were finite and had to be allocated according to priorities that balanced multiple demands, and the harbor situation had been downgraded from crisis to ongoing concern that could be managed through routine operations. The frustration was intense, but Blackwater had no effective recourse beyond continuing to do what he could within the constraints imposed. He maintained contact with fishermen who'd been cooperative, checked on them periodically, and tried to provide reassurance that law enforcement hadn't completely abandoned them. But the reassurance felt hollow when backed by resources that were clearly inadequate, and the fishermen recognized the reality as clearly as he did. Anana reached out occasionally from Anchorage, asking how things were progressing and whether it was safe for her to visit family in Kenai. Blackwater had to be honest that safety couldn't be guaranteed, that the network retained capability and apparent willingness to retaliate against those who'd cooperated with investigations. She accepted this news with resignation, recognizing that her exile from home was indefinite and possibly permanent. The injustice of her situation troubled Blackwater deeply, but he had no power to change the circumstances that made her continued absence necessary for her safety. Years passed, and Blackwater remained in Kenai, watching the harbor and its rhythms, responding to calls and investigating incidents that were always explained away as accidents or coincidences. No more boats burned with the obviousness of the original 4, but vessels experienced problems that resulted in their removal from service. Fishermen faced pressures that forced them out of the industry, and the network's influence persisted despite the investigation's disruptions. The visible, spectacular violence had been replaced by quieter forms of coercion that were harder to detect and prosecute, but which achieved similar results. He stood on the pier one evening as fog rolled in from the inlet, reducing the world to a small circle of visibility around him. The boats rocked gently in their slips, and water moved against pilings with sounds that were rhythmic and eternal. Somewhere beyond the fog was the broader inlet, and beyond that the ocean, and somewhere in that vastness were threats that would never be fully known or completely eliminated. The investigation had made a difference, had disrupted criminal operations and brought some measure of justice. But the victory was incomplete and temporary, and everyone involved knew that the struggle would continue indefinitely with no clear endpoint or final resolution. Torrin Blackwater turned away from the water and walked back toward his vehicle, carrying the weight of knowledge that couldn't be unlearned or forgotten. The fires had taught him about limits, about what law enforcement could achieve, and what remained forever beyond its reach, about the costs borne by those who cooperated, and the inadequacy of protections offered in return. The lessons were heavy but necessary, hard-earned understanding that would shape everything that followed. Behind him, the fog thickened over dark water, and the harbor settled into night, and somewhere in the invisible distance, threats remained active and patient, waiting for moments when vigilance would falter and opportunities would emerge. That was the reality he'd learned to live with. The permanent condition of contested territory where order and chaos met and struggled without final victory for either side. The work continued because stopping meant surrender. But continuation demanded more than could be sustained, and that impossible equation defined his existence in ways that would never be fully resolved.